very extreme example. They've had kind of 40, 50 years of kind of ongoing armed conflict. Even in the last 10 years, we have kind of mortality rates because of conflict, kind of well over 400,000 here. So it is an extreme example, but at the same time, the church has been very active in peacemaking here. And therefore, I think maybe there are opportunities to learn how things go well and how things don't go so well sometimes. And I'm still exploring how, my research in the book that it's freely available. It was written for an academic audience, and I'm really exploring, and I would love your advice about how I can use that research to kind of serve the Christian community. So yeah, and it was great to hear about kind of the focus that you have on peace these days. So I'm going to start with a story. So the picture might seem a bit odd to you. This is a picture of a very, very smart hotel in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and the buffet that is provided for guests. It's not in South Sudan at all. And in 2013, large-scale violence broke out in Juba in South Sudan, and it was very much along kind of historic lines. People that had fought each other 10 years before were fighting each other again. And very quickly, the kind of world superpowers wanted to make peace. They didn't want this conflict to happen. The UK, the US, Norway, China, there was actually kind of consensus at an international level that the conflict shouldn't happen. And therefore, they started peace negotiations, high-level peace negotiations, and they brought the kind of leaders of the warring parties together in this hotel in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And I was lucky to be there, and it was quite interesting because you could see the leaders of these different parties all basically eating together in this restaurant. So although they had soldiers on the front lines fighting each other, they were sitting and enjoying the buffet. They all knew each other because they had, they'd fought with each other, they'd fought for each other, against each other for decades, and they would sit and ask each other about their families. The negotiations at the time had decided to try and be inclusive, and so they had invited local leaders, local chiefs, to also attend these meetings. And my job, because I'd done some research in some of these places, was to help the chief kind of navigate the logistics of Addis Ababa. And so I was staying with them in another hotel, not such a nice hotel, but, down the road. But what was really interesting to me was that the chiefs carefully choreographed when they came to the restaurant to eat. They would not eat together. So chiefs from one side would come and they would eat, and then chiefs from the other side would come and they would eat. And they weren't aggressive to each other, they weren't rude to each other, but they would never eat together. And this kind of intrigued me. It was taking quite a lot of time. It was logistically complicated to organize all of this. And therefore I started asking about why would you not eat together? And they said, well, we are not at peace with each other. We see that, we see our political leaders eating together, but they are not at peace with each other either. They are fighting on the battlefield. But we are not at peace with each other, and so we won't eat together because we fear the kind of spiritual implications of war. And we fear if we eat together while our sons are fighting each other, that will be spiritually bad for us. And I asked them if they wanted peace, and of course they did want peace. No one in South Sudan wants to be living with this kind of endless armed conflict, these really kind of long-term decades of war. But what the chiefs were saying was that these kind of peace meetings that are made in capital cities far away and pieces of paper, they often don't have any meaning. They don't kind of confront the hurt and the spiritual pain and the spiritual consequences and the kind of bitterness, the hot hearts that result from conflict. Instead, they are just bits of paper that are written far away. But what they wanted was a more meaningful peace that would actually allow them to kind of peacefully eat together, where the fighting would stop and where they could kind of come together. And that really interested me, and that kind of prompted another 5 years of research to explore these issues of what they really meant by kind of spiritual consequences of conflict. But what I think is really interesting is that they saw that the problem was there, that the problem was in this kind of spiritual and moral realm, that actually that the big kind of superpowers of the world, as much money as they were pouring into these nice hotels in Addis, that wasn't where the solution was going to be, but it was in kind of confronting the pain and the hurt and the spiritual consequences of war that peace would really be made. So if you go to the next slide, So the church has been involved in South Sudan in peacemaking since the 1970s. Perfect, thank you. And there's a famous example of when they were involved in a very different way in peacemaking, not at the high level, but at the very local level. So in 1999, in a village called Wunlit, a Presbyterian church in America was very involved in kind of inviting chiefs to speak to them. They worked with South Sudanese church leaders, as well as a few like American church leaders who provided some funding and kind of worked closely with the South Sudanese church leaders. And they slowly talked to chiefs over time. They went and met them. The chiefs are on the ground. They know the conflict and are part of the conflict and part of protecting their communities from it. And over a couple of years, they had long and slow conversations. And eventually in Wunlit in 1999, they brought these fighting communities together. It was a long process. It was a slow process. It was a process that was potentially controversial because of the way it incorporated different kind of ideas and cultures, but also it was powerful because of that. And as a result of that very kind of intricate peacemaking and long conversations, war in this area ended for about 6 years. It didn't end forever, and sadly not, but that's a really long time in the context of South Sudan to have peace for 6 years. And what was really also interesting is some of the political leaders had to kind of make peace as a result because they could no longer mobilize people to fight. If we go to the next slide, but there were problems with Wunlit, and there are problems with any kind of peacemaking in South Sudan. One of the big challenges that the church has faced is that the kind of history of the church in this place has often meant that the church appeals more to educated people than uneducated people. So, for example, historically, you could only be baptized by a certain church if you could prove that you could read and write. You could only be baptized on graduation, which of course is probably very far from what we understand the gospel to be. But the history of that, even though that was happening kind of 50, 60 years ago, means that people who are not educated don't believe they can be part of the church, and they don't believe they can be part of the peace of the church. And at the same time, it's often uneducated people who are recruited to fight. And that has been a kind of real obstacle to peace. If we click forward another couple of slides. So I'll end with one example of a really kind of recent incident where the local church here did something very powerful. And I think a lot of the motivation behind it was their desire, if you click forward one more slide, was their desire to limit the consequences of conflict so that peace could still be made. So there is an area in South Sudan called Leia. It's really near some of the oil fields, and it's seen some of the biggest conflict of the war, large scale kind of population clearing, killings, kind of looting of property, burning of crops. And there was a kind of government garrison area and then kind of rebels outside in the rural areas. And the church I'm talking about was in these rebel areas, and they were meeting, and it was a Sunday morning. And just before this church service, some spies from the government area had been caught in the rebel area, and they had been killed. And they'd been left quite near where the church was. But basically, people were refusing to bury them. And so in South Sudan, it's really important that you're buried, and that you're buried fast to show that there is some dignity left. But people were refusing to bury them because they were so bitter that they were government spies in their area. So as the church gathered really near where all this had happened, the conversation that morning was not Bible teaching and worship. The conversation in the church was, can we bury these people? They were created by God, and they deserve a good burial. And after a lot of discussion, and despite armed youth saying that they shouldn't be buried, the church leaders and people in the church went out and they buried these people. And it was an act of incredible bravery, despite kind of armed opposition to it. That was a couple of years ago. And actually what's really interesting is there has now been peace between those government and rebel held areas. And I think those little acts where you're trying to reduce the kind of horrendousness of war and the kind of bravery of the church in that moment can just be so powerful. So anyway, my book is published, it's free online, so you don't have to buy it. It's not It's an academic book, so it's really boring, but if you ever want to read it, you're more than welcome, and the link is in the chat. But if anyone ever wants to talk about the book or anything else, they're very welcome to. I think I talk about some of the problems of peace and some of the problems of some types of peace, while obviously also recognizing that people really want peace, but they just want a kind of deep and meaningful peace, not just a piece of paper that's saying they should be at peace. I will leave it there. Thank you.